table pointing at each other, you know what I'm talking about? The ArtScroll printed it in English, okay. So that was written by a Yid called Rabbi Zevin. Now Rabbi Zevin actually was a Lubavitcher Chassid who ended up in Eretz Yisrael pre-war. And in his Sefer, it's divided up into two books, right? One is stories related to the Parashat Shavua, and one is stories related to the different Yom Tovim. So in the Yom Tovim one, the Moyadim, he has a section on Kitos Kislev. There's Zayis Lapella that they translate into English also, and they kept the Kitos Kislev section in. Al Kolpanim, he writes a story in the Kitos Kislev section like this. He says he knew of a fellow who lived in the city of Leningrad, which in Russia, Leningrad, St. Petersburg, was the capital city. That's where the Alter Rebbe was imprisoned. But we're not talking about in the times of the Alter Rebbe. We are talking about in the times of the Rebbe Rashab. And this was before communism, so there was still, the seat of the government was still in Leningrad. And to live in Leningrad, you had to be a very wealthy person, a chashuva person, with connections to the government. And most Yidden that lived in Leningrad were not very religious. There were very few that were religious that lived there. This was actually the case in the times of the Alter Rebbe also, and that's why the Alter Rebbe only wanted to take the food from Rabbi Leffler, etc., etc. But this fellow that we're talking about in our story was someone that came from Chassidic stock, meaning to say his parents and grandparents were Chassidim, Lubavitcher Chassidim. He lost his way somewhere along his life's journey and went off the derech, as they say nowadays. And he ended up becoming a very successful businessman, living in Leningrad with many connections to government ministers and the like. At that period of time, a picture of the Alter Rebbe was a rarity. But there was an artist, a famous Russian artist, that came along and painted a painting of the Alter Rebbe. This was the first time there was such a thing released, a painting of the Alter Rebbe. This fellow, because he had feelings for Chassidus, went ahead and commissioned this painter to paint for him a copy, another original, so to speak, of this painting of the Alter Rebbe. And then he said to him, 1 second, there's a picture of Tzemach Tzedek floating around also. Paint for me also a picture of Tzemach Tzedek. So he had made for himself, even though he wasn't from, painting of the Alter Rebbe, painting of Tzemach Tzedek. And he hung it up in his study, in his home. So here you have a home in which Tfeifus was being eaten, where there was parties at night for government ministers and important people in Leningrad. And in the study there's this big picture, a painting of the Alter Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek. This is the life that this fellow lived. One evening, he had a business matter that he was dealing with, which involved another Yid that lived in Leningrad. But this Yid was a Frum Yid. Not only was he a Frum Yid, he was a Chassid, Chabad Chassid. And it was an important thing that was taking place with this business dealing that he had with him, that he felt it important enough to run over to this Yid's home to talk to him about what needs to be done. Couldn't wait till he gets to the office the next morning. So he walks over to the home of this Frum Yid, a Chassid, and he knocks on the door. And it's understood that obviously this Frum Chassid also lived in a very large home because he was a wealthy businessman in Leningrad. And he comes into this grand hallway of the home, and he sees past the hallway the dining room area set up with tables, and there's candles lit, and there's a meal set, and there are Chassidim sitting around the table, and they're singing in the Gunim. So this fellow that was not yet from, or lost his way, starts thinking to himself, 1 second, I know this fellow from business. He didn't share with me that he has a family simcha, he has a child, making a bar mitzvah, a chasna, a shavah brachas. What's going on over here? In the meantime, the balabas of the home, the Lubavitcher, sees who walked into the hallway, so he runs from the dining room to greet him. What brings you here? So he said, I came here for the business thing, we have to work something out, very important paper has to get signed, whatever the case is. But what's going on in your house? You didn't share with me that it's a family simcha. What kind of family simcha? So the chassid says to him, yeah, you're right. It's taka family simcha. Right now, we, those that are assembled in the dining room, are in telephone communication. Telephones was a relatively chashuv, a new thing that was going on then. We're in telephone communication right now with our parents and grandparents in Gan Eden. guy looks and says, what are you talking about? So he says to him, tonight is Kitos Kislev. Kitos Kislev. Tonight, in Gan Eden, in the Alter Rebbe's chamber, all of the Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe, and their children, and their grandchildren, and the Chassidim of all the subsequent Rabbeim, are all gathered together, Fabringing Kitos Kislev. They're having their Kitos Kislev Fabringing with the Alter Rebbe. We, their children and grandchildren, are sitting here in Leningrad, and we are connecting ourselves to them through Fabringing in honor of Kitos Kislev, here, sitting here in Leningrad. This fellow, all of a sudden, got a jolt. And he was reminded, when he was a child, some 60 years back, that he lived in a town where his grandfather was the Rav of that town. And as we said, they were Chassidim, they were Lubavitch Chassidim. And how his grandfather would make a Kitos Kislev Suda in the shoulder for the community. And how his grandmother used to prepare the potatoes and the herring, whatever they had over there. And how his mother used to help along. And he was a little child watching the scene. And now he's seeing the scene of these Chassidim sitting around the table, singing the Nagunim that he heard as a child growing up in his home. And you could see on his face a certain yearning, a longing, that he really wanted to have a part in this. So the host, the chassid, was no fool, and he saw what's going on externally on his face. So he said, come and join us. You'll have regards from your father and your grandfather. The guy says, I'm not Chassidishe. I mean, that's what he said, basically. To me, you know what kind of lifestyle I live. I don't belong there. So the host insisted, no, come join us. And he led him in slowly into the Fabrengen. And he made him feel very comfortable. He sat himself down next to him. He was my caravan. Half hour passes, an hour passes, an hour and a half passes, 2 hours pass. Rabbi Zevin writes, this fellow got so lost in the Fabrengen, engrossed in it, he totally forgot that he had theater tickets that he bought that night, that he was supposed to take one of the Rosh HaShana ministers in Leningrad out for a trip to the theater in order to find favor with him, for a business deal, whatever the case was. He totally forgot about it. And he came home to his house 2-3 in the morning, and he walked into his study. And he took a look up at the picture they had hanging there of the Alter Rebbe and of the Tzemach Tzedek. And he had such a hispariness, such an emotional feel, that he went into his bookcases and he found somewhere buried there a siddur that he had. And he took it out, and for the first time since he was a little child, he opened up a siddur and he davened Ma'ariv. The next day he went ahead, threw out all his treifa kelim, got somebody to come into kasher in his kitchen, and from there on, the rest is history. The Rabbi Zevin doesn't describe it. But the point that he's trying to illustrate in that story is this idea that although perhaps, just like that fellow, didn't see the Alter Rebbe, we didn't see the Alter Rebbe either. Although this fellow was disconnected from everything, at the end of the day, he knew his roots. He knew where he came from. He knew what his parents and grandparents had Mesilas Nefesh for. And when he was brought into that situation, it was motivated him to come back to his roots and reconnect. Because it's not just that we say to a boy or to a bacher or to a young man, that we say to him, oh, you have to do, we're demanding of you, you have to make a chotos tevis. It's not just that. You're also being empowered.